What would you do if a stranger wearing a fake uniform struck your wife in broad daylight? For Jack Donnelly, a retired Navy SEAL, the answer came naturally. You fight back. And what followed rattled an entire neighborhood. The smack cut through the air sharper than it should have. It wasn't just noise, it was ignition. A single spark that tore through a quiet suburban street on a warm afternoon in Round Rock, Texas. Neighbors with garden hoses froze mid-spray. Children abandoned their bikes where they stood. Even the steady hum of a passing car seemed to fade, as though the whole world paused in disbelief. Trevor Langley, dressed in a phony HOA uniform, loomed over Hannah Donnelly. Her hand clutched her stinging cheek, her face flushed with equal parts pain and fury. All she had done was tend to her rose bushes in her own front yard, and in that moment, Trevor failed to realize the danger he had awakened. Because just a few steps away stood her husband, Jack Donnelly. A man forged by 2 decades of Navy SEAL service. A man whose veins now ran not with panic, but with the chilling focus only warriors like him possess. He had endured firefights, walked out of ambushes, and dragged wounded brothers to safety across burning sand. But none of it compared to the fury that surged through him as he watched a stranger lay hands on his wife in their own yard. "Did you just strike my wife?" Jack's voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the air, sharp and cold. Like steel grinding against stone. Trevor let out a shaky laugh, masking his nerves with false bravado, and glanced at the 2 men flanking him, his so-called security detail, each dressed in counterfeit uniforms with flimsy badges clipped to cheap belts. "She was out of line," Trevor sneered. "Breaking HOA rules. Somebody has to keep order." "Order?" Jack stepped forward, his gaze locked on Trevor. "You think this is order?" The neighbors stirred uneasily. Mrs. Reynolds from across the street whispered, "They've been bullying everyone." "I knew something like this would happen." Her husband tugged her gently back toward their porch, not wanting to be drawn into the storm gathering on the Donnellys' lawn. And then Hannah's voice cracked through the tension. "Jack, don't!" she pleaded, her hand pressed to her reddened cheek. Her voice wavered yet carried strength. She wasn't begging him to stop. She was warning him to tread carefully. Hannah knew her husband better than anyone, knew what lived beneath his calm exterior, and she could see in his eyes that the switch had already been thrown. Trevor misread it entirely. He smirked, taking Hannah's plea as weakness. "You people don't understand," he sneered. "We control this neighborhood now. Break the rules, and you pay." Jack's lips pulled into something that resembled a smile, but wasn't. "Consequences?" he said quietly, tilting his head. "For striking my wife? Let me show you what consequences look like." Before Trevor could even draw breath, Jack was in motion. No wasted movement, no pause. In a heartbeat, Trevor's arm was wrenched behind his back, his knees collapsing under the crushing grip. The 2 fake enforcers lunged, but Jack met them head-on. A precise kick slammed into the first man's chest, folding him to the ground, gasping for air. The second swung clumsily, only to be caught. Jack seized his wrist, twisted, and yanked him hard to the dirt. The watching crowd erupted with gasps, neighbors covering their mouths, the shock of what they were witnessing spreading like fire through the quiet street. Some neighbors whispered hurried prayers. For months, they had watched these self-appointed HOA bullies parade through the streets as if they owned them. No one had dared to resist. Until now. Trevor groaned, his cheek grinding into the dirt as Jack bent low, his voice calm but edged with iron. "It's over," he said, each word slow, precise. "You'll never lay a hand on her or anyone else again." The 2 imposters staggered upright, bruised and breathless, caught between fleeing or charging once more. But one look at Jack's unflinching stare froze them in place. They already knew they'd lost. Across the road, a teenager lifted his phone, filming with wide eyes. "Yo, this is insane," he muttered, capturing a scene that would ripple through the neighborhood before the day was done, and at the center of it all stood Hannah. Her cheeks still burned, but she stood tall, her gaze steady, filled with both pride and a flood of relief. She had glimpsed this side of her husband only once before, years back, when deployment nightmares had jolted him awake. But this moment was no dream. This was real. This was real. Right there on their own front lawn. Trevor whimpered beneath Jack's hold, and in the distance, the wail of sirens drifted closer. Someone had called the cops. The crowd swelled, murmurs rippling through it. In one explosive afternoon, the balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted. Jack loosened his grip just enough for Trevor to gasp, but his hand stayed locked like iron. "You better hope those sirens are coming for you," he muttered. "Because if they're not, I'm not done." The sound of sirens grew sharper, red and blue lights bouncing off the houses as police cruisers turned onto the street. A new question spread like wildfire through the gathering crowd. Who were these men really, and how had they been allowed to play leaders for so long? But the truth would take time to unravel. For Jack and Hannah Donnelly, it all traced back to the moment they left Plano, Texas. Not fleeing something, but chasing a dream. After Jack's 20 years of Navy SEAL service, they wanted nothing more than peace, a quieter life. He was finished with deployments, with hotel rooms that reeked of dust, and with nights where rest came only in broken fragments. Through it all, Hannah had stood steady, waiting, worrying, raising their 2 children who were now away at college. Together they longed for a home where the air felt lighter, where mornings began with birdsong instead of alarms and briefings. Round Rock looked like that dream. Wide streets shaded by oaks, neat lawns, a park just down the road, and neighbors who smiled as they strolled with their dogs. Their new house sat on a corner lot, simple but inviting. With a porch swing Hannah instantly claimed as her sanctuary for evening tea. That first night, she whispered, "Feels like we can finally breathe here." Jack kissed her temple and thought, "Yeah, maybe we can." And at first, life did feel calm. The Donnellys unpacked, introduced themselves to a few neighbors, and settled into the gentler rhythm of suburban days. Jack took to running the trails each morning, while Hannah spent her afternoons nurturing the flower beds she'd always dreamed of. Her hands pressed into the soil as if, along with the roses, she was trying to anchor their lives firmly into this new place. But peace is fragile, easily disturbed. The first time Jack noticed them was on a Sunday morning. He was jogging back from the trails when he spotted 3 men moving in formation down the street. They wore identical navy polo shirts with HOA security stitched in white across the chest. Not police, not even close, but each carried utility belts stocked with flashlights, radios, and something that looked a lot like pepper spray. One of them stopped at a neighbor's driveway, scribbling on a clipboard while scolding a young couple about leaving recycling bins out too early. Jack slowed, observing from across the street. His instincts prickled. Their stance was too rigid, their stares too sharp. These weren't friendly volunteers reminding folks of guidelines. They moved like men convinced they had authority, like they owned the block. That evening, over dinner, Jack told Hannah what he'd seen. "They're calling themselves security," he said grimly. Jack shook his head. "I'm not buying it. Feels more like a power trip than anything else." Hannah frowned. "You think they're actually legit? Maybe the HOA really hired them?" "Maybe," Jack admitted, "but they don't look trained. More like guys who ordered uniforms online." He shoved his plate back, irritation simmering. "I don't like it." The following week, Hannah had her own run-in. She was walking back from the mailbox when one of the men, she'd later learn his name was Trevor Langley, stepped in her path. His eyes flicked from the box to her. "Paint's peeling," he said flatly. "That's a violation. You've got 10 days to fix it, or you'll be fined." Hannah blinked. "Excuse me?" The HOA usually mails notices. "They don't send people door to door." Trevor leaned in, too close, his tone smug. "That's how it used to be. Things are different now. We're not afraid to enforce the rules." That evening, Hannah told Jack the story, her voice tight with frustration. "He talked to me like I was a criminal over paint." "Paint!" Jack's jaw clenched, eyes narrowing. "I'll handle it. Don't let them intimidate you." When Jack phoned the HOA office the next day, the receptionist sounded baffled. "Sir, we don't have a security team. We've never had one. If someone's saying that, they're not with us." The words hit like a switch flipping. Jack had dealt with pretenders before, men who wore false authority like a mask, and he knew how dangerous it could be to let imposters roam unchecked. Soon, whispers began to spread. The Reynolds across the street admitted the so-called HOA officers had threatened fines over too many lawn decorations. The Parkers confessed that one of the men had yelled at their teenage son for shooting hoops in the driveway after 9 p.m. Everyone had a story, but no one had dared to challenge them. Fear had settled over the neighborhood like a suffocating fog. One evening, as Jack watered the grass, he spotted Trevor again, clipboard in hand, pointing at a neighbor's car parked along the curb. Jack called out, "Hey, you! Do you actually work for the HOA?" Later that afternoon, as Jack walked down the block, neighbors greeted him with a warmth that hadn't been there before. Margaret Reynolds sat knitting on her porch, no longer glancing nervously over her shoulder. The Chens trimmed their hedges without fear of another phony citation landing in their mailbox. Children laughed as they bounced basketballs in driveways again, the sound of normal life cautiously returning. Kids rode their bikes, laughter echoing down the block. For the first time since the Donnellys had moved in, the neighborhood felt alive again. Halfway down the street, Carla Park stopped Jack. "I just wanted to thank you again," she said earnestly. "You didn't just defend Hannah, you defended all of us." Jack shook his head. "I only did what anyone should have." Carla gave a faint smile. "Maybe, but not everyone would have had the courage." Her words lingered with him as he walked back home. Jack wasn't blind to the truth. His years in the Navy had given him the instincts and the discipline to act when others froze. But deep down he knew this fight had never been about combat. It was about community, neighbors remembering they had a voice. That evening, Hannah joined him on the porch swing, resting her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think we moved here for a reason?" she asked softly. Jack tilted his head toward her. "What do you mean?" "We came looking for peace, a fresh start. But maybe we were meant to help this neighborhood find its strength again." Jack looked out at the street, porch lights glowing as the sun slipped below the horizon. "Life has a way of putting you where you're needed," he said quietly. "Sometimes peace isn't something you stumble upon. Sometimes it's something you build." Hannah smiled, her eyes steady. "And we did." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was warm, comforting. The silence of two people who had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. The group chat buzzed with updates. A missing dog returned home, unfamiliar cars reported, neighbors checking in on one another. Bake sales were announced. Neighbors who once kept their distance now stopped to check in on each other. The Chens hosted another gathering, this time not out of fear but simply for fun. Laughter spilled from open garages. Kids chased each other across front lawns. And for the first time in a long while, Round Rock felt like a real community again. Trevor and his crew faced charges, impersonating officers, harassment, assault. Their scheme even made the local paper under the headline, "Fake HOA Enforcers Exposed by Neighborhood Residents." The article mentioned the Donnellys by name, though Jack brushed off the attention when reporters called. "It wasn't just me," he told them. "It was all of us, finally standing together." One quiet evening, Jack and Hannah strolled hand in hand down the street. Hannah paused to admire the roses she had replanted after the confrontation. She touched a bloom lightly, her voice calm but certain. "Every time I look at these, I'll remember not the slap, but what came after." Jack slipped his arm around her shoulders. "That's how it should be. Pain doesn't get the last word. Strength does." And in that moment, Hannah understood the deeper truth. Their neighborhood hadn't just been freed from imposters. It had been reminded of something people too often forget. Courage isn't about never feeling fear. It's about refusing to let fear decide how you live. Months later, when people in Round Rock spoke of the Donnellys, they didn't just talk about the fight or the fake HOA cops. They remembered how one act of defiance against cruelty became the spark that united an entire community. And for Jack and Hannah, it was a lasting reminder: peace is never passive. It's something you stand for, something you protect, and sometimes something you build with your own hands. Peace is something worth protecting, even on the quietest streets. Choosing to stand up for what's right can feel risky, but choosing silence is always more dangerous. If you believe courage and unity matter, don't forget to subscribe and follow along for more stories like this, because the struggles that define us aren't only fought in distant places. Sometimes they happen right outside our own front doors. If we can prove the money they collected, they won't be walking away from this, Ward said. The reassurance settled over the group like a thin blanket. It didn't erase the anger, but it eased the sharpest edge of fear. Still, Jack wasn't satisfied. What about the neighbors they scammed? Do they get their money back? Anderson hesitated. That'll depend on the investigation. But your testimony and theirs will go a long way. Hannah shifted, her voice quiet but firm. I just want to make sure no one else goes through this. It's not just the money. It was the way he looked at me, like I was nothing. Her words struck deeper than anything Jack had said. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some neighbors nodding, others wiping at their eyes. Ward snapped her notebook shut. We'll be in touch with updates. And don't be surprised if we come back around. We'll need statements from everyone. Her gaze settled on Jack. Mr. Donnelly, you handled yourself better than most would have. But next time, let us take it from here. Jack gave a short nod. Next time, maybe you'll get here before my wife gets hit. Anderson winced at the jab, but didn't argue. The truth stung too much to deny. As the officers returned to their cruiser, the neighbors stood in silence, absorbing everything they'd just heard. Margaret Reynolds finally broke it, her voice shaky but resolute. Fraud in El Paso, extortion, and here we were thinking it was just stricter HOA rules. I feel so foolish. Jack turned toward her, his tone steady, grounding. You're not foolish. That's exactly what they counted on, people assuming they were legitimate. That's what predators do, Jack said evenly. They hide behind the illusion of authority. The shame isn't on you, it's on them. For the first time in weeks, Margaret Reynolds straightened her back, her cane planted firmly on the pavement. Tom Alvarez muttered, So what now? We just wait for court dates while they sit in a cell? What if they make bail? Jack didn't sugarcoat it. Then we stay alert. But now the police know. The system knows. And most importantly, he swept his hand toward the circle of neighbors. We know. They can't blend in anymore. The crowd lingered, voices low but different now, less afraid, more determined. The silence that had once smothered the street was gone, replaced with something raw and unfiltered. Resolve. Hannah slipped her hand into Jack's. Her cheek still throbbed, but she stood taller than she had in days. I never thought roses and pruning shears would end with police cars on our lawn, she said softly. Jack gave a half smile. Life has a way of testing us where we least expect it. He paused, glancing out the window at neighbors still huddled together under porch lights. But tonight proved something. This street isn't powerless anymore. Still, the question loomed. Would fear creep back in once the lights dimmed, or would they finally build something stronger together? 2 days later, the Chen family's garage overflowed. Folding chairs scraped against concrete, kids leaned on their bikes near the back, and neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to talk about their future. The scent of brewed coffee and the faint sweetness of packaged cookies lingered in the garage, but nobody had gathered for snacks. They were there because the fragile sense of security they'd all relied on had been stripped away, and everyone felt it. Mr. Chen cleared his throat, tapping a spoon gently against a mug to quiet the room. Thank you for coming, he began, voice unsteady but earnest. We've all lived here a long time, but I don't think we've ever come together like this. Not for block parties, not for holidays, and certainly not for something as serious as this. Carla Park rose first. She brushed a lock of dark hair behind her ear, her eyes sweeping across the group. We all sensed something was wrong, and we ignored it, because ignoring it was easier than confronting it. But then Hannah was struck in her own yard. If Jack hadn't been there, her voice caught, the words sticking in her throat. If he hadn't stepped in, Who knows what Trevor would have done? A ripple of unease moved through the garage. In the front row, Hannah sat quietly, her cheek still faintly bruised but healing. Jack's hand rested firmly over hers, anchoring her as dozens of eyes turned toward them. Mrs. Reynolds lifted her hand, hesitant, almost embarrassed. "I was frightened," she admitted. "I paid them money I didn't owe because I thought if I refused, they'd retaliate. I'm not proud of it, but in that moment, I thought, better me than my family." Jack rose slowly, and without raising his voice, the room shifted its focus to him. His presence alone commanded attention. "None of you should carry shame," he said firmly. "You were targeted." Fear was their weapon. But here's the truth. When we stay silent, fear wins. When we speak up, it loses its grip. What happened to Hannah was terrible. But it forced us to realize something, Jack continued. We can't afford silence anymore. Tom Alvarez leaned forward in his chair, arms crossed tight. "Easy for you to say, Jack. You're trained for this. You've been in combat. What about the rest of us? We're teachers, accountants, retirees. We don't have your skills," Jack nodded. "You're right. You don't have my training. But you don't need it. What you need is each other. Bullies thrive by keeping people isolated, by convincing you you're alone. When they laid a hand on Hannah, everyone saw it. Everyone knew it was wrong. That's what broke their grip. Not me, not even Hannah, but the fact that the entire street finally saw the truth for what it was." The garage grew quiet, his words sinking into every corner. Hannah spoke next, her voice steady though her eyes shimmered with feeling. "When Trevor hit me, I wasn't just angry. I felt small, diminished, like I didn't matter. But then I looked up and saw my neighbors, saw you, watching. And I realized this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We can't live in a place where fear dictates how we act." Margaret Reynolds pushed herself up, steadying with her cane. "She's right. I've lived here 30 years, and I'll be damned if I let a few imposters scare me out of my own home. But she's also right about something else. It shouldn't have taken Hannah being struck for us to finally wake up." Carla Park stood again, her voice firmer now, carrying across the garage. "So what do we do? Because waiting for the police isn't enough. We need to start looking out for each other. If something feels wrong, we say it. If someone's harassed, we don't whisper, we face it together." A few heads nodded in agreement, the spark of resolve beginning to grow. But Tom still sat back in his chair, doubt etched across his face. "And if someone else shows up, another Trevor, what then?" Tom asked. Jack didn't hesitate. "Then we deal with it together. Not with fists, but with unity. If Trevor had walked down this street and seen 30 neighbors standing side by side instead of one woman alone, he never would have dared. That's the difference between fear and strength." The conversation shifted from anger to action. Numbers were exchanged. A group chat was created, and neighbors began talking about evening walk rotations so no one felt alone. It wasn't about replacing the police. It was about refusing to ever be silent victims again. For the first time in months, laughter rippled through the room when Mr. Chen joked, "If anyone ever tries to find me from my bushes again, I'll send them straight to Jack." The tension eased, but before the night closed, Jack rose once more. His eyes moved across the faces of people who, just a week earlier, had felt like strangers. This neighborhood is only as strong as we make it. You don't need a badge or a uniform to defend it. What you need is courage, honesty, and the will to stand up for one another. That's how you make sure no one like Trevor ever finds a foothold here again. The garage filled with applause, not loud but heartfelt. People left with more than phone numbers and plans. They left with something they hadn't felt in months: belonging, responsibility, and strength. Later, as the Donnellys walked home under the warm glow of porch lights, Hannah squeezed Jack's hand. "Do you think they'll follow through?" she asked softly. Jack glanced around at neighbors lingering on porches, talking in low but determined voices. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think they finally will." As the neighbors dispersed into their homes, their voices lingered in the warm night air. They'd had a wake-up call, and once fear is unmasked, it can't be forgotten. But even as the neighborhood grew stronger that night, the Donnellys knew their own reckoning wasn't over. This fight had changed more than the street. It had changed their lives. The next morning, Sunlight spilled across the Donnellys' kitchen table. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt like the same home they'd moved into weeks earlier. Something was different now. Hannah cradled a mug of tea, her cheek almost fully healed, her eyes drifting to the roses outside, the same roses she'd been trimming when Trevor first confronted her. She touched the fading mark gently, as if reminding herself how close fear had come to planting itself in their lives. Jack set down 2 plates of scrambled eggs and sat across from her. "You didn't eat much last night," he said softly. "I wasn't hungry," she admitted. Then, after a pause, "But today feels different, lighter." Jack gave a small nod. "Because they're gone." "No," she corrected, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Because we're not alone anymore." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with everything they'd endured, but softened by the relief of knowing their street had finally stood together. More voices rose behind Carla. Mr. Chen shouted, "They came after me and my wife, claimed we owed fines that didn't exist." Mrs. Reynolds added, her voice trembling, "They threatened me over my curtains. I've been too scared to speak up until now." The police cruiser screeched to a stop, tires grinding on asphalt. Doors flew open and 2 deputies stepped out, hands resting on their holsters. One of them, Officer Ramirez, took in the scene. 3 imposters battered and broken, Jack standing tall at the center of the yard, and a crowd of neighbors circling like witnesses to a long-awaited reckoning. "What happened here?" Ramirez demanded. Before Jack could reply, Carla stepped forward, pointing at Trevor. "Those men aren't HOA security. They're frauds. They've been terrorizing this street for months." And today, he hit Hannah Donnelly. "Right in the face!" Ramirez's gaze snapped to Jack. "Sir, is that true?" Jack gave a firm nod. "My wife was trimming the roses." He came at her with bogus violations, then struck her. "I stepped in." Hannah stepped closer, her cheek still red but her voice steady. "He hit me. In front of everyone." Ramirez's jaw tightened. He turned to Trevor. "You got anything to say to that?" Trevor opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The bravado was gone. The other deputies moved in, frisking the men, pulling fake IDs from their pockets and unfastening the cheap imitation badges from their belts. One deputy shook his head. "These are worthless. Not even close to real." As the imposters were lined up against the squad car, the neighborhood erupted, relief and anger boiling over after months of silence. Voices overlapped in a storm of confession and fury. "They threatened my kid! They fined us for nothing! They made us all afraid!" The weight of fear was finally breaking. "They tried to fine us for nothing. We were scared to even step outside," another neighbor shouted, the words spilling into the air. Jack stood quietly, his eyes fixed on Hannah. She gave him the smallest nod, grateful, proud, though still shaken. He slipped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. Officer Ramirez approached. "We'll need formal statements." "Looks like you did a number on them." Jack's voice was calm, unwavering. "I didn't lay a hand on them until after they touched my wife." Ramirez studied him for a long beat, then nodded. "Given the witnesses here, I don't think you'll have much to worry about." Behind them, Trevor was shoved into the back of a cruiser, his face twisted with fury. "This isn't over!" he shouted, his threat cut off by the slam of the car door. Jack didn't flinch. He simply watched as the vehicle pulled away, his arm still wrapped protectively around Hannah. But as the flashing lights faded into the distance, the neighborhood understood. This fight had never just been about 3 imposters. It was about reclaiming their community from the grip of fear. For once, people didn't scatter when the police left. Instead, they lingered, gathered in clusters on porches and sidewalks, whispering, replaying what they had just witnessed. Months of silence had been shattered, replaced by a new current of energy. Anger, yes, but also relief. Hannah leaned into Jack, her cheek still tender. He guided her gently toward the porch steps, ready to sit with her at last. But before they could, something else was about to unfold. Carla Park stepped forward, her voice trembling but her eyes burning with resolve. "You did what the rest of us were too scared to do. I don't even know how to thank you." Jack shook his head firmly. Don't thank me. Just stop staying quiet. That's how people like them get away with it. Carla's gaze shifted to Hannah's cheek, anger flickering across her face. I should have spoken up sooner. We all should have. More neighbors drifted closer. Mr. Chen cleared his throat, his voice heavy with guilt. They came to my house 3 times. Said my mailbox was out of compliance. I paid them $50, thought it was real. My wife told me not to, but I didn't want trouble. His shoulders sagged. You're not the only one, Mrs. Reynolds added quickly. They took $200 from me, said my curtains violated some rule. I was terrified they'd vandalize my home if I refused. The crowd swelled with voices, stories tumbling over each other, fake fines, threats of property damage, kids harassed for playing outside. Each confession painted the same picture, an entire neighborhood living under intimidation, not authority. Jack stood silently, arms crossed, listening. His eyes scanned the group, weighing their words. When the noise finally ebbed, he spoke. You all knew something was wrong, but fear kept you in line. I get it, not everyone's trained to fight back, but silence is what gave them power. From the back of the crowd, a voice rose. It was Tom Alvarez, a neighbor Jack had barely spoken to before. Easy for you to say, Tom called out. You're a SEAL. You've been through combat. The rest of us? We've got jobs, families. We can't afford to get hurt or dragged into fights. Jack locked eyes with Tom, his voice steady but commanding. I'm not asking anyone here to throw punches. I'm asking you to stop pretending nothing's wrong. Report it. Speak up. Stand together. One man alone can be ignored, but a neighborhood united? That can't be silenced. Tom looked down, uneasy, but Jack's words lingered in the air. Then Hannah's voice rose, stronger than anyone expected. When he hit me, it wasn't just pain. It was humiliation. He wanted me to feel small. But I didn't, because I knew Jack was right there, and because I know none of us should have to live in fear of men like that. If you let people like Trevor run things, they'll keep taking until there's nothing left to give. A hush fell. Then Margaret Reynolds shuffled forward, leaning on her cane. Her voice cracked, but her words were iron. She's right. I've lived here 30 years. This is my home. And I'll be damned if I let 3 punks in fake uniforms tell me how to live. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Agreement. For the first time in months, the heavy blanket of fear seemed to lift, replaced by something sturdier, resolve. Jack slipped his arm around Hannah, drawing her close. You all saw what happened today. They're gone, for now. But don't think they won't try again. The police will deal with the charges. But the real fight is making sure nobody like them ever believes this neighborhood is easy prey again. Carla nodded, determination in her face. Then maybe it's time we had a meeting. Not the HOA board, but us. The people who actually live here. We need to talk about how to protect each other. Mr. Chen lifted a cautious hand. You can use my garage. It's big enough, but we should do it soon, before people slip back into silence. A low rumble of agreement swept through the group. Neighbors who had spent months avoiding each other's eyes were now talking, planning, sketching out the beginnings of unity that hadn't existed before. As the crowd slowly dispersed back toward their homes, Hannah finally sank onto the porch swing. She leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. You think this really changes anything? Jack's gaze swept the street, where the last rays of sunlight stretched long across the rooftops. Yeah, he said quietly. It changes everything. Fear kept them strong. That fear's gone now. For the first time since moving to Round Rock, Hannah felt something she hadn't in weeks. Safety. Not because the threat had vanished, but because their neighbors were finally waking up. But the night wasn't over. The danger was deeper than they'd known. And when the police returned with news about Trevor's past, the neighborhood would realize just how close they had been to real trouble. An hour later, the last squad car looped back onto the block. The street was quieter now, though tension still lingered under the glow of porch lights. Shadows stretched long across driveways where neighbors huddled in clusters, rehashing every detail of the day. 2 officers approached the Donnellys' porch. The taller one, Sergeant Kyle Anderson, moved with the weary confidence of a man who had seen plenty of trouble in his career, but rarely trouble quite like this. His partner followed close behind, eyes sharp. notebook in hand. Deputy Lisa Ward flipped open a small notebook as she and Sergeant Anderson walked up the steps. "Mr. and Mrs. Donnelly," Anderson began, "we'll need to get your formal statements. But before we do, there's something you should probably know." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Meaning what?" Anderson leaned against the porch railing, his voice dropping lower. "We ran their IDs. Trevor Langley's got a record. Fraud, intimidation, even an old assault charge out of El Paso. He's been drifting from place to place, running scams like this for years." Hannah's stomach nodded. "So this wasn't the first time?" Ward nodded. "No, ma'am. Different neighborhoods, same routine, fake uniforms, phony badges, counterfeit citations. They pretend to be HOA enforcers, scare people into paying up, and most residents don't question it. Until tonight, no one's pushed back this hard." Jack exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "How long would they have kept it up here if no one had spoken out?" Anderson gave a grim shrug. "As long as they could. People freeze when they think they're staring at authority, even when it's fake. They see a badge, a clipboard, and they fall in line. From across the yard, Carla Park stepped closer, arms folded. So what now? Do they just get a slap on the wrist and show up again in a few weeks?" Ward shook her head, her tone firm. "Not this time. We've got multiple witnesses, video recordings, and Mrs. Donnelly's assault. They're facing charges, impersonating an officer, harassment, assault, maybe even extortion. This one sticks." The days that followed brought smaller clashes. Trevor's crew left phony violation slips taped to mailboxes. They shadowed neighbors on evening walks, scribbling infractions into their clipboards. One afternoon, Jack caught them loitering outside his own fence, pretending to measure the grass. He stepped out onto the porch and stood silently, his presence alone enough to send them away. Neighbors noticed. Some whispered quiet thanks as they passed, grateful for his watchful eye. Others avoided him entirely, too frightened that acknowledging him might draw the impostor's wrath. The street had split between those who looked to Jack for protection and those who prayed the whole mess would simply vanish. One evening, with the sky burning orange in the setting sun, Carla Park returned, her voice hushed and urgent. "Jack, you need to be careful. I overheard Trevor bragging. He said he's going to make an example out of someone this week." Jack's stomach tightened. "Did he say who?" Carla hesitated, then nodded. "He mentioned Hannah." Jack exhaled slowly, controlling the surge of anger in his chest. "Thank you, Carla. I'll take it from here." That night, while Hannah slept peacefully upstairs, Jack sat in the darkened living room, his gaze fixed on the street outside. Every sound tightened his focus. A car door slamming, a dog barking, the crunch of footsteps along the sidewalk. He was waiting, watching, ready. Jack's instincts screamed at him to move, to act, but he knew striking too soon could backfire. Under his breath, barely audible, he muttered, "If he so much as touches her, I won't hold back." But Trevor wasn't planning to wait. His so-called example was coming sooner than anyone expected. By Saturday afternoon, a strange tension hung over the street. The Texas heat was heavy and sticky, clinging to skin and clothes. Hannah, restless and eager for distraction, pulled on her wide-brimmed hat and garden gloves before stepping outside. Tending her roses always calmed her, the steady rhythm of pruning, coaxing beauty from thorns, reminding her of the peace they'd come here searching for. She knelt by the flower bed, carefully trimming blooms when a shadow spilled across the lawn. Hannah looked up. Trevor Langley. He stood far too close, clipboard tucked beneath his arm like some false badge of authority. Behind him, two of his officers lingered at the sidewalk, arms crossed, silent but menacing. "Afternoon, Mrs. Donnelly," Trevor drawled. "Looks like we've got a problem here." Hannah rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her gloves. "What kind of problem?" Trevor tapped his clipboard. "HOA Regulation 12C, no landscaping that obstructs a walkway. Your roses are creeping out too far. Someone might get scratched." Hannah arched an eyebrow. "Those roses have been here since the day we moved in. No one's ever complained. And as far as I know, the HOA doesn't send men like you knocking on doors." Trevor's smile curved, but his eyes stayed cold. "Times change," Trevor sneered. "We're cracking down. If you don't fix this by tomorrow, there'll be a fine." Hannah crossed her arms, refusing to back down. You don't scare me, Trevor. I called the HOA myself. They told me you're not official. You're just pretending. The smirk slid from his face. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. You think you're brave, huh? Talking back? Maybe your husband filled your head with that Navy toughness. But you're not him! Hannah's pulse hammered, but her words stayed firm. And you're not security. You're just a bully in a polo shirt. Trevor's jaw twitched. For a heartbeat, he just stared, the air thick with his anger. Then it happened. Sudden, ugly. His hand snapped up and struck her across the face. The crack split the quiet street sharp and brutal, louder than the droning cicadas. Gasps erupted. Mrs. Reynolds dropped her garden hose, water spilling across the grass. Carla Park froze on her porch, one hand over her mouth. The slap wasn't just an attack, it was a statement. A show of dominance, meant to shame and silence. Hannah staggered, her hand flying to her cheek. Pain flared hot across her face, but she held the tears back. Instead, she locked her eyes on Trevor, voice trembling but defiant. You'll regret that. And then came a voice she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Did you just hit my wife? Jack stood on the porch, arms folded, eyes locked on Trevor. He'd let Hannah hold her ground as long as she could. But the moment Trevor struck her, something inside Jack snapped into perfect, dangerous focus. Trevor spun around and forced out a laugh. She crossed the line. Someone had to put her in her place. Jack advanced, every step measured, deliberate. Someone, he said. You think you're somebody? You just made the biggest mistake of your life. The two imposters shifted, uneasy. One muttered, Trevor, maybe we should... Shut up, Trevor snapped, fighting to keep hold of the moment, but his voice wavered enough to give him away. Jack closed the distance until they were inches apart, his voice calm, almost ice-cold. You have two choices. Apologize to her now, or I make sure you never lay hands on anyone again. Trevor sneered, trying macho bravado. You scared, soldier boy? You're retired. What can you do? That was the line that broke. Jack's fist flew, clean and fast, slamming into Trevor's jaw. Trevor pitched backward and hit the pavement hard. Before the other two could properly react, Jack moved with practiced speed, grabbing one by the collar, wrenching his arm, and flipping him onto the lawn with a grunt. The second lunged. Jack met him, blocked the blow, and delivered a precise elbow that sent the man sprawling. Neighbors gasped, some barely holding back cheers. For months, they'd lived under the shadow of these imposters. Now, within seconds, those bullies were collapsing under the hands of a man who had finally decided enough was enough. Trevor groaned, clutching his jaw as Jack stood over him. You think this is finished? Trevor spat, blood darkening his lip. Jack bent low, his voice level and controlled. It's finished when I say it's finished. And trust me, it's finished. In the distance, the sirens that had seemed faint earlier swelled into clarity. Red and blue lights racing down the street toward them. Someone had already called the police. Neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering, phones lifted to capture every second. Hannah, still holding her cheek, stepped forward and laid a hand on Jack's arm. The simple touch steadied him, pulled him back from the edge. She whispered, I'm okay. You did what you had to do. Jack turned to her, his eyes still burning, but now mixed with something deeper. Love, protection, fury barely restrained. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before straightening again, bracing himself for the officers he knew were on their way. But even before the police arrived, the truth about the imposters and the fracture in the neighborhood was already breaking wide open. Sirens wailed closer, still blocks away as Jack shifted his stance. Trevor Langley lay in the grass clutching his jaw, blood streaking down his chin. His two sidekicks staggered like amateurs, one nursing a twisted wrist, the other gasping for air after taking Jack's knee to the ribs. Porches and sidewalks filled with onlookers. Phones glowed recording. This wasn't a private dispute anymore. It had become a public reckoning. And at the center stood Jack Donnelly. Trevor spat into the grass and forced himself upright. His arrogance hadn't left him, but his voice betrayed a tremor. You think you're some kind of hero? You think people are going to thank you for this? You don't even know who you're messing with. Jack stepped forward once, his presence alone silencing the crowd. His reply was calm, cold, unshakable. "No, you don't know who you're messing with. You put your hands on my wife, that's something you don't walk away from." Trevor's men made a final desperate move, rushing Jack at once. But his instincts took over, sharp, efficient, unstoppable. The first swung wildly. Jack slipped aside, seized his wrist, and twisted until the man dropped to his knees with a cry of pain. The second lunged, but Jack drove a precise strike into his chest. The impact stole his breath, and he crumpled onto the lawn, clutching his ribs, gasping for air. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors let out hushed cheers. Others pulled their children back, shielding young eyes from the violence unraveling on their quiet street. Hannah stood just a few feet away, her hand pressed to her cheek, watching her husband become the man she'd only glimpsed in fragments before, the soldier who knew how to end a fight in seconds. Jack crouched beside Trevor, who was shaking now, less from pain, more from fear. His voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "You ever touch her again, or anyone in this neighborhood, and your worries won't be about fines. They'll be about walking." Trevor forced a weak laugh, but it rang hollow. You don't scare me," he muttered, his eyes flicking nervously toward the growing crowd. Jack leaned closer, his words razor-sharp. "Then let me make this clear. I don't bluff." The wail of sirens swelled, red and blue lights flashing against the houses as patrol cars rounded the corner. The imposters froze, their bravado draining away in an instant, and then for the first time, someone else stepped forward. Carla Park, her voice shaky but steady, pointed directly at Trevor. "I saw it." He slapped her. "We've all seen what they've been doing. He's been harassing us for months." Trevor straightened, smirk tugging at his lips. "We work for the community," he said smoothly. "Somebody's got to keep order." The arrogance in his tone carried an edge of threat, and Jack felt it. Still, he held back. Charging in too soon could backfire. Better to wait, to watch, to gather proof. Hannah, though, couldn't hide her unease. One night on the porch swing, she whispered, "It feels like they're circling, like they're waiting for someone to fight back." Jack squeezed her hand, his voice steady. "Let them circle. They have no idea who they're up against. What?" Hannah didn't realize was how. Soon that fight was going to find them. Neither of them knew how quickly things would escalate, or how ugly it could get by their third week in the new house. The Donnellys had begun piecing together bits of rumor. Nothing shouted from rooftops, nothing spelled out in full, just fragments traded in hushed voices when others weren't around. At first, Jack chalked it up to neighborhood gossip. But the more he listened, the clearer the pattern became. Something was rotting beneath the surface here, and it wore a cheap navy polo with HOA security stitched across the chest. It was Hannah who caught the first real thread. She was returning a pie dish to Margaret Reynolds, their elderly neighbor across the street, when Margaret lowered her voice. "Those men came by last month," she whispered. "Told me my curtains didn't match the exterior paint. Said if I didn't replace them, they'd fine me $100. Hannah blinked in disbelief. "Your curtains? How could that even be a rule?" "That's what I asked," Margaret said, glancing anxiously at her front window as though the men might appear at any moment. "But when I questioned them, one leaned over my porch rail and said, 'Rules are rules.'" "Don't make us come back." A cold shiver slid down Hannah's spine. She thanked Margaret politely, but the story gnawed at her the rest of the day. When she relayed it to Jack that evening, he exhaled slowly, controlled. "That's not enforcement," he said flatly. "That's intimidation." The next whisper came from the Parkers. Their teenage son, Devin, had been shooting hoops one evening when one of the imposters stormed over and barked at him to stop. Devin, lanky and 17, had just shrugged and kept dribbling. The man snatched the ball and hurled it into the bushes. "Driveways aren't for games," the man growled. "Consider this your warning." When Jack heard that story, he shook his head grimly. These guys aren't just pretending, they're escalating. Word kept spreading. From the Chen family down the street came another piece of the puzzle. Their mailbox had been slapped with a fake citation, complete with a forged signature from HOA enforcement. It claimed their front shrubs were non-compliant. Mr. Chen, who had lived there for more than a decade, carried the notice to an official HOA meeting. The board members stared at it in disbelief. "We've never issued anything like this," they told him. That was the moment Jack knew. The Donnellys weren't dealing with an overzealous neighborhood watch. They were staring down imposters running a scam built on fear and false authority. One quiet Saturday afternoon, as Jack and Hannah sat on their porch swing, a soft knock sounded at their side gate. It was Carla Park, a woman in her 40s from 2 houses down. She looked equal parts anxious and relieved. "I heard about what happened," Carla said, shifting uneasily. "Trevor giving you grief about the mailbox." Hannah nodded slowly. "You've dealt with them too?" Carla gave a bitter laugh. "Oh, we all have. Everyone on this street. They told me my kids' bikes had to be stored inside or we'd be fined. When I asked to see the rule in writing, one of them leaned in and said, 'Don't test us.' My husband wanted to report it. But we've seen how aggressive they can get. It feels easier to just give in." Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was steady but sharp. "So you've all been letting them push you around because you're scared?" Carla's eyes fell to the ground, shame flickering across her face. "We don't have military training like you, Jack," Carla said quietly. "We're just regular people trying to get by." Jack's tone softened. "You don't need training to tell the truth. You just need to stand together. Bullies only win when no one pushes back." Carla gave him a small, thankful smile before heading home, but Jack could still see the weight she carried. It was the same burden pressing on the entire neighborhood, everyone acting as if nothing was wrong because speaking up felt too dangerous. That evening, Hannah tried to lighten things with a warm, home-cooked dinner. But Jack barely touched his food. His gaze stayed fixed on the window, his mind far away. "You're thinking about them again," Hannah said gently. "I can't help it," Jack admitted. "They're feeding on good people, people who don't know how to fight back. And if it keeps going, it's only a matter of time before something worse happens." Hannah set her fork down. "What if we just kept our heads down, stayed out of it?" Jack turned to her, his expression hard. "If we do that, we're no better than the ones letting it happen. The day they put their hands on someone, that's the day everything changes." Hannah didn't argue. She knew he was right. She also knew how far Jack was willing to go when pushed. Later that night, as they sat together on the porch swing, headlights swept across their yard. A car slowed in front of their house. The window rolled down and Trevor's voice slithered through the dark. "Pretty flowers, Mrs. Donnelly. Be a shame if someone reported them for blocking the walkway." Jack rose instantly, every muscle coiled with tension. But before he could move, the car roared away into the night. Laughter faded down the street, leaving Hannah clutching Jack's arm. "Please," she whispered. "Don't start something yet." Jack's jaw tightened as he stared at the taillights disappearing into the night. His reply was quiet but steady. They already did, but the clash he was bracing for wouldn't come on his terms. It would arrive at his doorstep in a way no one expected. The first time Jack truly went toe-to-toe with Trevor Langley, it wasn't planned. It was a sweltering Tuesday, the kind of heat that made the air ripple above the asphalt. Jack had just pulled into the driveway with groceries when he noticed Trevor and his 2 sidekicks camped outside the Chen's house. Clipboard in hand, Trevor circled their yard like a vulture, scribbling notes while muttering at the couple about non-compliant shrubbery. Jack set his grocery bags on the hood of his truck and strode over. "Hey," he called, his voice calm but edged with steel. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Trevor turned, his smirk snapping into place the moment he recognized him. "Conducting inspections. Standard HOA security procedure." "Wouldn't expect you to get it," Jack folded his arms. "Funny thing, I called the real HOA office last week. They told me they don't even have a security team. So why don't you explain that?" The 2 men flanking Trevor shifted uneasily, but Trevor stood his ground, eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "We're the ones keeping this neighborhood in line. The HOA doesn't have the backbone to enforce the rules. We do." Jack let the silence stretch between them, his gaze locked and unblinking. Years of reading men in hostile places had taught him one thing: Trevor was bluffing. Years in combat zones had taught Jack one truth: the loudest men were usually the weakest. "You strut around in bargain bin uniforms barking like you're cops," he said evenly. "But I've seen what real authority looks like. And trust me, you don't have it." Trevor's grin faltered, if only for a beat. "Careful, Donnelly," he sneered. "This isn't the military. You don't get to call the shots here." "I don't need to," Jack replied, his tone flat. "But if you lay a hand on one more neighbor, you'll wish you'd never stepped foot on this street." The standoff thickened, the silence sharp. Behind them, Mr. Chen froze on his porch while his wife clung tightly to his arm. Nobody moved. Then Trevor leaned closer, his voice low and mocking. "Let's see how tough you are when it's your wife breaking the rules." Jack's jaw tightened, but he refused the bait. Instead, he stepped back and lifted his voice, loud enough for the Chens to hear. "If anyone bothers you again, you come straight to me. Don't let these clowns scare you." Trevor's eyes narrowed, dark with anger. "You just made yourself a target." "Then aim carefully," Jack shot back before turning toward his truck to collect the groceries. That night, the confrontation replayed in his head on a loop. At the kitchen table, he recounted every word to Hannah, holding nothing back. Her face drained of color when he repeated Trevor's threat about her. "He mentioned me?" she asked quietly, setting her mug of tea down with trembling hands. Jack reached across, wrapping her hand in his. "They're bluffing. Bullies always do, but I'm not letting them anywhere near you, Hannah. Not ever." "You can't fight everyone," Hannah whispered. "This isn't a battlefield, it's our home." Jack's reply was steady, but his eyes burned with the same fire she had seen during his deployments. "It's both now," he said.